Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
Standing in that sterile courtroom on a cold Tuesday morning in Denver, I watched my mother Janet point her manicured finger directly at me, like I was some kind of criminal. Her voice carried across the room with theatrical precision as she declared to Judge Patricia Morrison, "This boy only knows how to waste what he doesn't deserve." She was demanding every single penny of the $2 million my beloved grandmother Rose had left me in her will, claiming I was too irresponsible and unworthy to handle such wealth. Judge Morrison nodded approvingly, while Janet's shark lawyer Bradley Hoffman smirked with confident satisfaction. The entire courtroom felt stacked against me, until I looked directly at the judge and spoke two simple words that drained every drop of color from her face, transforming the entire proceeding in ways none of them could have anticipated. Growing up in the quiet suburbs of Denver, Colorado, my grandmother Rose Patterson was the steady heartbeat of my childhood, while my mother Janet remained a distant figure always chasing her next real estate commission. Rose owned 3 successful vintage bookshops called Patterson Pages, scattered across Denver, Boulder, and Colorado Springs, each one filled with the warm scent of aged paper and the gentle sound of turning pages. From the time I turned 5 years old, Janet would drop me off at Rose's main shop on 16th Street every morning before racing off to show properties to wealthy clients from California and Texas. Those early years shaped everything I would become. Rose taught me chess on rainy afternoons, showing me how every piece had its purpose, and every move carried consequences that rippled across the entire board. During summer months, we would tend her elaborate garden behind the bookshop, where she grew heirloom tomatoes, purple basil, and rows of foxgloves that attracted hummingbirds throughout July and August. She never spoke down to me like other adults did, instead explaining the economics of running a small business as we sorted inventory and balanced cash registers each evening. Janet, meanwhile, seemed to resent every moment I spent with Rose. She would arrive at closing time with tight lips and sharp words, complaining that Rose was spoiling me with too much attention and filling my head with unrealistic expectations about life. The tension between them crackled like static electricity. Whenever they occupied the same room, though I never fully understood why Janet harbored such obvious bitterness toward her own mother. When Rose turned 82, her arthritis began limiting her mobility around the shops. I had just graduated from Colorado State University with a business degree and immediately moved back to Denver to help manage her daily operations. Those 18 months working alongside Rose were the most meaningful of my life, watching her interact with longtime customers who had been visiting her shops for decades, learning how she had built genuine relationships that transcended simple commercial transactions. Rose began experiencing dizzy spells and fatigue during the winter months, which her doctor attributed to natural aging and mild anemia. She started forgetting small details about inventory and occasionally struggled to remember regular customers' names changes that worried me deeply, because Rose had always possessed an encyclopedic memory for faces and stories. Despite these concerning symptoms, she remained determined to maintain her independence and continue running Patterson Pages with minimal assistance. The first major shock came when Rose's lawyer called to inform me that she had updated her will, leaving her entire estate to me instead of Janet. The inheritance included the 3 bookshops, her Victorian home in Cherry Creek, and nearly $2 million in savings and investments accumulated over 40 years of careful financial planning. Rose explained her decision during a quiet conversation in her kitchen, saying she wanted her legacy to remain connected to books and learning, rather than being liquidated for quick profit. Janet's reaction was immediate and volcanic. She stormed into Rose's house the evening after learning about the will change, screaming accusations about manipulation and undue influence, while Rose sat calmly at her dining room table, Janet claimed I had somehow brainwashed her mother into cutting her out of the inheritance, despite the obvious fact that Rose had made her decision independently after months of careful consideration. Within 2 weeks of that confrontation, Janet had hired Bradley Hoffman, a family law attorney, notorious throughout Denver for his ruthless tactics in inheritance disputes. Hoffman specialized in challenging wills by claiming beneficiaries were mentally incompetent or had exercised improper influence over elderly relatives. His success rate in overturning estate plans made him the preferred choice for bitter family members seeking to reverse unfavorable inheritance decisions. The legal papers arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a process server who found me shelving books in the main Patterson Pages location. Janet was petitioning the court to declare me mentally incompetent to manage financial affairs, citing supposed evidence of gambling addiction, reckless spending habits, and general irresponsibility with money. The petition requested a full psychological evaluation and immediate suspension of my access to any inheritance pending a competency hearing. Reading those accusations felt like being punched in the stomach by someone I had trusted completely. Janet had described me as someone who wasted money on frivolous purchases, gambled away savings on online poker sites, and demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment that made me unsuitable for managing significant wealth. Every single claim was fabricated, but the legal language made these lies sound official and credible to anyone unfamiliar with the actual facts of my life. The psychological evaluation took place at a downtown clinic where I spent 3 hours answering questions about my financial habits, decision-making processes, and general approach to responsibility. Dr. Margaret Sullivan administered various cognitive tests and personality assessments designed to determine my mental capacity for handling complex financial matters. Her final report concluded that I demonstrated above-average intelligence, sound judgment, and appropriate financial awareness findings that should have ended Janet's legal challenge immediately. However, Bradley Hoffman proved surprisingly resourceful in manufacturing additional evidence to support their case. During the weeks leading up to our court hearing, I began noticing strange charges appearing on my bank statements from restaurants I had never visited, online gambling sites I had never accessed, and luxury retailers where I had never shopped. Someone had clearly gained unauthorized access to my financial accounts and was creating fraudulent transactions to support Janet's claims about my irresponsible spending patterns. The most devastating discovery came when I realized Janet had been secretly recording our private conversations for months using a small digital device hidden in her purse during family visits. She had captured audio of me discussing various business ideas, investment possibilities, and casual remarks about wanting to travel or upgrade my apartment someday. Taken out of context and edited carefully, these innocent conversations could be twisted to suggest grandiose thinking, unrealistic planning, or poor financial judgment. Standing there with those legal papers in my hands, surrounded by Rose's carefully curated collection of classic literature, I felt the weight of betrayal settling over me like a heavy blanket. My own mother had violated our relationship in the deepest possible way, secretly gathering evidence to use against me in court, while pretending to maintain normal family interactions. The realization that she had been planning this attack for months made every recent conversation feel contaminated with deception and manipulation. Walking into the Jefferson County Courthouse that Tuesday morning felt like entering enemy territory. I arrived early, hoping to collect my thoughts before facing what I knew would be a carefully orchestrated attack on my character and competence. The building buzzed with the usual activity of lawyers, clerks, and anxious families navigating various legal proceedings. But my attention focused immediately on the sight of Janet and Judge Patricia Morrison, chatting like old friends in the hallway outside courtroom 6. Their comfortable familiarity struck me as unusual, given that judicial ethics typically required judges to maintain professional distance from parties involved in cases they were scheduled to hear. Janet laughed at something Judge Morrison said, touching her arm in a gesture that suggested years of personal friendship rather than a formal legal relationship. When they noticed me watching, both women quickly separated and adopted more appropriate courtroom demeanor, but their earlier interaction left me feeling even more uncertain about receiving fair treatment during the hearing. Bradley Hoffman arrived wearing an expensive charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. He greeted Janet with professional warmth before nodding curtly in my direction, his expression conveying the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome of our legal battle. My own attorney, Mark Chen, seemed competent, but inexperienced compared to Hoffman's polished presentation and obvious political connections within the Denver legal community. The courtroom itself was smaller than I had expected, with wooden benches that reminded me of church pews and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh, unflattering shadows. Judge Morrison took her position behind the bench with an air of authority that immediately established the power dynamics we would be navigating for the next several hours. Her clerk called our case, and Bradley Hoffman rose to present Janet's petition with theatrical flourish. Hoffman began by painting a picture of me as a young man who had never learned proper financial responsibility due to excessive spoiling by an overindulgent grandmother. He described Rose as a well-meaning but naive elderly woman who had been manipulated by my supposed charm and false promises about continuing her legacy. According to Hoffman's narrative, I had spent years positioning myself as the perfect grandson while secretly harboring plans to liquidate Rose's assets for personal gain as soon as possible. The fabricated evidence came next, presented with professional polish that made obvious lies appear credible and official. Hoffman displayed enlarged copies of bank statements showing gambling transactions, restaurant charges, and retail purchases that painted a portrait of reckless spending and poor impulse control. He had somehow obtained documentation from online poker sites, luxury car dealerships, and high-end electronic stores, all suggesting a pattern of behavior completely inconsistent with my actual lifestyle and values. Each piece of false evidence struck me like a physical blow, watching my reputation being systematically destroyed by documents I had never seen before. Hoffman claimed I had lost over $15,000 gambling on sports betting websites during the past 6 months, purchased a $30,000 motorcycle that I kept hidden from Rose, and made numerous cash withdrawals from ATMs located near casinos and racetracks throughout Colorado. Every single transaction was fabricated, but the documentation appeared authentic enough to convince anyone unfamiliar with the sophisticated techniques used to create fraudulent financial records. Janet took the witness stand with tears streaming down her face, delivering a performance worthy of professional theater. She described her heartbreak at watching me take advantage of Rose's declining mental faculties, claiming I had isolated her mother from other family members, while filling her head with lies about Janet's supposed greed and selfishness. According to Janet's testimony, I had convinced Rose that her own daughter was only interested in money rather than maintaining genuine family relationships. The emotional manipulation reached its peak when Janet described finding Rose crying in her kitchen after I had supposedly pressured her about updating her will. She claimed I had threatened to abandon Rose in her old age unless she changed her estate planning to favor me over Janet, using emotional blackmail to secure my position as primary beneficiary. These accusations were particularly painful because they represented the exact opposite of my actual relationship with Rose, which had been built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared interests rather than financial calculations. Judge Morrison's bias became increasingly obvious as the hearing progressed. Whenever Mark Chen attempted to object to questionable evidence or testimony, Judge Morrison would cut him off with sharp reprimands about proper courtroom procedure. She allowed Hoffman considerable latitude in presenting his case while strictly limiting our opportunities to challenge the validity of their documentation or the credibility of Janet's emotional testimony. The most sophisticated piece of manufactured evidence came in the form of doctored social media posts, allegedly from my various online accounts. Hoffman presented screenshots showing me bragging about expensive purchases, discussing get-rich-quick schemes, and making jokes about taking advantage of elderly relatives. The posts used language and humor that sounded plausibly like something I might write, suggesting someone had studied my actual social media activity carefully before creating these convincing forgeries. During a brief recess, I witnessed another disturbing interaction between Janet and Judge Morrison. They stepped into a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, speaking in hushed tones that I couldn't quite overhear from my position in the hallway. However, their body language suggested they were discussing something far more significant than normal courtroom scheduling or procedural matters. When they emerged 15 minutes later, both women appeared satisfied with whatever agreement they had reached. Mark Chen did his best to challenge the prosecution's evidence, pointing out inconsistencies in the financial documentation and questioning the convenient timing of many alleged transactions. He presented character witnesses who testified about my responsible behavior and genuine care for Rose's well-being, including several longtime customers of Patterson Pages who had observed our working relationship firsthand. Unfortunately, Judge Morrison dismissed most of this testimony as irrelevant to questions about my financial competency. The hearing's emotional climax arrived when Hoffman played audio recordings of conversations between Janet and me, carefully edited to remove context and create misleading impressions about my intentions. In one particularly damaging excerpt, I could be heard discussing plans to cash in on Rose's legacy, though the original conversation had actually been about cashing checks from book sales to deposit in her business account. The manipulation was subtle, but effective, making innocent statements sound calculating and mercenary. As the afternoon wore on, I realized we were not participating in a fair legal proceeding, but rather watching a carefully choreographed performance, designed to produce a predetermined outcome. Janet's tears, Hoffman's evidence, and Judge Morrison's biased rulings all pointed toward a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple inheritance greed. The sophistication of the fraudulent documentation and the judge's obvious favoritism suggested resources and connections that went well beyond what Janet could have arranged on her own. The final piece of testimony came from Dr. Kevin Nash, a forensic accountant who had allegedly reviewed my financial records and concluded that I demonstrated patterns consistent with gambling addiction and compulsive spending. Dr. Nash presented his findings with academic authority, describing psychological profiles and behavioral indicators that painted me as someone fundamentally unsuited for managing significant wealth. His testimony was particularly devastating because it provided scientific legitimacy to Janet's emotional accusations. However, as Dr. Nash spoke, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Judge Morrison was nodding along with his presentation in ways that suggested prior familiarity with his conclusions, as if they had discussed his testimony before the hearing began. More disturbing still, I caught a glimpse of paperwork on Hoffman's table that referenced something called the Morrison-Blake development deal, with financial projections that seemed completely unrelated to our inheritance dispute. The hearing concluded with closing arguments that felt like mere formalities, given the obvious predetermined outcome. Hoffman summarized his case with practiced eloquence, requesting that the court declare me incompetent and transfer Rose's entire estate to Janet as the responsible adult family member. Mark Chen made a valiant effort to defend my character and challenge the prosecution's evidence, but Judge Morrison's expression made clear that she had already reached her decision. As we waited for Judge Morrison to announce her ruling, I realized that this legal proceeding was actually the final act of a much larger criminal conspiracy. The fraudulent evidence, the judge's bias, and the suspicious familiarity between all the major players suggested that Janet had not simply hired a lawyer to contest Rose's will, but had instead joined forces with corrupt officials to orchestrate a sophisticated theft of my inheritance. The two words I was about to speak would expose this conspiracy and transform our courtroom drama into something none of them had anticipated. Before I could speak those two crucial words, Judge Morrison began delivering what she clearly believed would be her final ruling in our case. Her voice carried the authoritative tone of someone completely confident in her decision, explaining that the evidence presented by Janet's legal team had convinced her that I lacked the maturity and judgment necessary to manage significant financial resources. She cited Dr. Nash's psychological assessment, the fabricated financial records, and Janet's emotional testimony as compelling proof of my unfitness to inherit Rose's estate. However, as Judge Morrison spoke, I noticed something that made my suspicions crystallize into horrifying certainty. Among the papers scattered across Hoffman's table, I could clearly see documents bearing the letterhead of Morrison Blake Development Corporation, a real estate investment company that I now realized must be connected to Judge Morrison herself. The financial projections and property valuations visible on those documents had nothing to do with our inheritance case, but everything to do with a much larger conspiracy involving Rose's valuable bookshop properties. During the brief recess before closing arguments, I had managed to overhear fragments of conversation between Janet and Judge Morrison as they huddled near the water fountain outside the courtroom. Janet whispered something about needing clean money fast for the Morrison-Blake deal, while Judge Morrison responded with assurances that everything would be handled properly before the development deadline next month. The pieces of their conspiracy were finally falling into place in ways that revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise. My mind raced back to the strange paperwork I had discovered in Rose's home office after her funeral documents that had seemed unimportant at the time, but now took on sinister significance. Among Rose's personal files, I had found several real estate contracts bearing Judge Morrison's signature, along with property appraisals that valued her bookshop locations at amounts far exceeding their actual market worth. These papers had confused me because Rose had never mentioned any plans to sell her properties or enter into real estate partnerships with investors. The revelation hit me like a physical blow as I realized what Janet and Judge Morrison had been planning all along. They needed Rose's inheritance to fall into Janet's hands, not because of simple family greed, but because they had been using Rose's bookshop properties as illegal collateral for their real estate speculation ventures. The Morrison-Blake development deal required immediate access to clean capital, and Rose's $2 million estate represented the perfect solution to their cash flow problems. Looking back through Rose's financial records with new understanding, I could see evidence of unauthorized transactions and forged signatures that had allowed Janet to pledge Rose's properties as security for high-risk development loans. Judge Morrison's position on the bench had provided legal cover for these fraudulent arrangements, while her friendship with Janet had facilitated access to Rose's business accounts and property deeds. They had been systematically looting Rose's assets for months while she was still alive, using her declining health as cover for their criminal activities. The scope of their conspiracy extended far beyond simple inheritance fraud. As I sat in that courtroom listening to Judge Morrison's predetermined ruling, I realized that Rose's death itself might not have been natural. Her sudden decline during the winter months, the unexplained fatigue and confusion, the dizzy spells that her doctor had attributed to normal aging, all of these symptoms were consistent with slow poisoning using digitalis extracted from the foxglove plants in her own garden. Janet had always possessed extensive knowledge about gardening and herbal remedies skills she had learned during her childhood on her grandfather's farm in rural Colorado. She certainly knew which plants were toxic and how to extract dangerous compounds for malicious purposes. The foxgloves in Rose's garden would have provided an ideal source of cardiac glycosides that could mimic heart conditions and create symptoms that appeared to be natural aging-related decline. More disturbing still, I remembered Janet's frequent visits to Rose's house during those final months, always carrying small containers of homemade soup or herbal tea that she claimed would help boost Rose's energy and improve her appetite. Rose had always been polite about accepting these offerings, though she privately confided to me that Janet's sudden interest in her health seemed suspiciously out of character, given their historically distant relationship. The murder plot became even clearer as I recalled Rose's growing paranoia during her final weeks, her concerns that someone was going through her personal papers and accessing her business accounts without authorization. She had started hiding important documents in unusual places around her house and had even mentioned changing her locks because she felt unsafe sleeping alone at night. These weren't the confused ramblings of an elderly woman suffering from dementia, but the legitimate fears of someone who had discovered she was being systematically betrayed by her own family. Judge Morrison's ruling continued with detailed explanations about the legal standards for determining mental competency and the court's responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from their own poor judgment. Her words carried the weight of legal authority while simultaneously covering up one of the most sophisticated inheritance fraud schemes in Colorado's history. She was literally stealing my grandmother's legacy while hiding behind the respectability of her judicial position. Bradley Hoffman's confident smirk grew wider as Judge Morrison approached the climax of her decision, clearly anticipating the moment when Janet would be declared the rightful heir to Rose's entire estate. His expensive suit and polished presentation had been perfectly designed to create the appearance of legitimate legal proceedings while facilitating what was essentially an elaborate theft orchestrated by corrupt public officials and their criminal associates. The financial documents scattered across Hoffman's table told the real story of this conspiracy. Morrison Blake Development had been using Rose's bookshop properties as collateral for increasingly risky real estate ventures throughout Denver's rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. When their speculation deals began failing, they needed immediate access to Rose's liquid assets to avoid bankruptcy and criminal exposure for their fraudulent loan arrangements. Dr. Nash's testimony about my supposed psychological unfitness had been the final piece of their elaborate deception, providing scientific cover for transferring Rose's inheritance to Janet's control. His forensic accounting credentials and academic authority had given credibility to conclusions that were based entirely on fabricated evidence and predetermined outcomes, rather than objective analysis of my actual financial behavior. As Judge Morrison prepared to announce her final decision awarding Rose's entire estate to Janet, I realized that this moment represented my only opportunity to expose their conspiracy before they could complete their theft. The two words I was about to speak would shatter their carefully constructed illusion of legitimate legal proceedings and reveal the true criminal nature of everything we had witnessed in that courtroom. Taking a deep breath and looking directly into Judge Morrison's confident eyes, I spoke clearly and calmly, ensuring that every person in the courtroom could hear my response to her anticipated ruling. Those two simple words would transform this inheritance dispute into a federal criminal investigation that would destroy the lives of everyone involved in the conspiracy against Rose's memory and my future. I looked directly at Judge Morrison and spoke two words that had been burning in my chest since the moment I understood the true scope of their conspiracy. Hello, Grandma. The effect was immediate and devastating. Judge Morrison's face drained of all color as she realized I had discovered the truth about her real relationship to our family. Janet gasped audibly from her seat at the plaintiff's table, while Bradley Hoffman's confident smirk disappeared entirely as he began to comprehend the implications of what I had just revealed to the entire courtroom. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Judge Morrison attempted to regain her composure, demanding to know what I meant by such an inappropriate outburst during formal legal proceedings. However, her voice trembled with barely controlled panic as she spoke, and several court officials exchanged confused glances at the obvious personal connection that my words had exposed. What none of them knew was that I had spent the previous 3 weeks conducting my own investigation into the conspiracy against Rose's estate, working with FBI agent Sarah Williams, who had been monitoring Morrison Blake Development Corporation for federal crimes related to money laundering and real estate fraud. Agent Williams had discovered that Judge Morrison was actually Rose's sister Margaret, who had legally changed her name and fabricated her entire personal history after stealing the identity of a deceased law school graduate named Patricia Morrison 30 years earlier. The real Patricia Morrison had died in a car accident in Wyoming during 1993, but Margaret Patterson had assumed her identity and used forged transcripts to gain admission to the Colorado Bar Association. She had spent 3 decades building a respectable legal career while hiding her true relationship to Rose and systematically planning to steal her sister's accumulated wealth through elaborate inheritance fraud schemes. Rose had discovered Margaret's deception during her final months, finding old family photographs and birth certificates hidden in Margaret's personal effects during a visit to her home. Rose had been quietly gathering evidence of her sister's identity theft and judicial corruption while pretending to remain unaware of the conspiracy developing around her. Her apparent decline in mental faculties had actually been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to lure Margaret into revealing the full scope of her criminal activities. The FBI investigation had uncovered a massive network of corruption involving dozens of fraudulent inheritance cases, illegal property seizures, and systematic elder abuse throughout Colorado's judicial system. Margaret, operating under her false identity as Judge Morrison, had been transferring assets from elderly victims to criminal associates for over 15 years, using her position on the bench to legitimize theft while avoiding detection by law enforcement. Agent Williams had been recording our entire court hearing using hidden surveillance equipment installed throughout the courtroom, with approval from federal prosecutors who were building racketeering charges against Margaret's criminal organization. Every word of testimony, every piece of fraudulent evidence, and every biased ruling had been captured for use in federal court proceedings that would expose the true scope of this eldericide operation. Janet's role in the conspiracy extended far beyond simple inheritance greed. She had been working as Margaret's primary recruitment agent, identifying wealthy elderly clients through her real estate business and gathering intelligence about their family relationships, health status, and financial resources. Once suitable targets were identified, Janet would begin the systematic process of isolating them from legitimate family members, while Margaret arranged for fraudulent legal proceedings that would transfer their assets to criminal control. The poisoning operation had been Margaret's specialty, using her knowledge of cardiac medications and botanical toxins to eliminate elderly victims whose deaths needed to appear natural to avoid arousing suspicion from law enforcement or medical examiners. She had perfected techniques for extracting digitalis from common garden plants and administering fatal doses through seemingly innocent gifts of food beverages and herbal remedies prepared by accomplices like Janet. Dr. Kevin Nash had been providing fraudulent medical documentation to support Margaret's inheritance theft schemes, falsifying death certificates and psychological evaluations to create legal justification for transferring assets away from legitimate heirs. His academic credentials and forensic accounting expertise had provided scientific credibility to conclusions that were based entirely on criminal conspiracy rather than objective medical analysis. Bradley Hoffman's law firm had been laundering the proceeds from Margaret's inheritance fraud operation using offshore accounts and shell companies to disguise stolen assets before distributing them among various criminal participants. His expensive lifestyle and political connections had been funded entirely by systematic theft from elderly victims whose families never suspected the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy that had destroyed their loved ones. The Morrison Blake Development Corporation had been Margaret's primary vehicle for converting stolen inheritance money into legitimate real estate investments that could be sold without arousing suspicion from financial regulators. However, their increasingly risky speculation deals had begun failing spectacularly, creating cash flow problems that required immediate access to Rose's liquid assets to avoid bankruptcy and criminal exposure. Rose's decision to change her will in my favor had disrupted Margaret's carefully planned timeline for accessing her sister's wealth, forcing the conspiracy into desperate measures that ultimately exposed their criminal activities to federal investigation. Margaret's attempt to declare me mentally incompetent had been a last-ditch effort to gain legal control over Rose's estate before their real estate deals collapsed completely. The truth about Rose's death was even more horrifying than I had initially suspected. She had not died from digitalis poisoning as Margaret had planned, but had instead survived the assassination attempt by secretly working with her trusted physician, Dr. Amanda Foster, to neutralize the toxic effects while pretending to decline naturally. Rose had endured months of carefully controlled poisoning symptoms to maintain her cover while gathering irrefutable evidence of Margaret's criminal activities. Dr. Foster had been providing Rose with antidotes and medical monitoring throughout the poisoning operation, allowing her to survive Margaret's murder attempts while maintaining the appearance of natural death from heart failure related to advanced age. The funeral had been staged using sophisticated mortuary techniques that created the illusion of death, while Rose actually remained hidden in a secure location under federal protection. Agent Williams revealed that Rose had been wearing recording devices during her final months, capturing conversations with Margaret Janet and their criminal associates that provided detailed evidence of their eldericide operation. These recordings had been crucial for understanding the full scope of the conspiracy and identifying all participants in the criminal organization. The Swiss bank account that Rose had established contained copies of every fraudulent document used in Margaret's inheritance theft schemes, along with financial records proving that over 30 elderly victims had been murdered for their assets during the past decade. Rose's investigation had been far more comprehensive than any of the criminals had suspected, providing federal prosecutors with evidence sufficient to secure life sentences for everyone involved. As the reality of their exposed conspiracy sank in, Margaret made one final desperate attempt to maintain her false identity and judicial authority. She demanded that court security remove me from the courtroom for contempt, claiming that my outburst was disrupting legitimate legal proceedings and showing disrespect for the judicial process. However, Agent Williams chose that moment to enter the courtroom, with a team of federal agents announcing that everyone present was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, inheritance, fraud, identity theft, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. The carefully orchestrated illusion of legitimate legal proceedings collapsed instantly as handcuffs were placed on Margaret Janet Bradley Hoffman and Dr. Nash simultaneously. The courtroom erupted into chaos as federal agents moved to secure the scene and arrest the criminals who had been operating their elaborate conspiracy under the cover of legitimate judicial proceedings. Margaret's desperate attempts to maintain her false authority as Judge Morrison crumbled completely when Agent Williams presented federal arrest warrants bearing her real name and detailed criminal charges spanning 3 decades of systematic fraud and murder. Janet's reaction was perhaps the most dramatic, collapsing into hysterical sobbing as she realized that her carefully planned inheritance theft had instead exposed her participation in a criminal enterprise that would likely result in life imprisonment. She began screaming about how Margaret had forced her to participate in the eldericide scheme by threatening to harm me. But her claims of coercion rang hollow, given the extensive evidence of her enthusiastic involvement in targeting and murdering elderly victims. Bradley Hoffman attempted to destroy documents from his briefcase before being restrained by federal agents, confirming suspicions that his legal files contained evidence of money laundering operations and offshore accounts used to hide stolen inheritance money. His expensive suit and confident demeanor disappeared entirely as he faced the reality of federal prosecution for his role in facilitating inheritance fraud and accessory to multiple murders. Dr. Nash simply sat in stunned silence, as federal agents read him his rights, apparently unable to process how his academic credentials and forensic expertise had been manipulated to provide scientific legitimacy to a systematic murder operation. His psychological evaluations and financial analyses had been crucial components of Margaret's inheritance theft schemes, making him complicit in crimes that had resulted in dozens of deaths throughout Colorado. The most shocking revelation came when Agent Williams announced that Rose Patterson was still alive and had been working undercover with federal investigators for the past 8 months. The courtroom doors opened to reveal Rose walking slowly but steadily into the room, her presence causing Janet to faint completely and Margaret to begin screaming incoherent denials about family relationships and stolen identities. Rose looked remarkably healthy for someone who was supposed to have died 6 months earlier from heart failure related to advanced age. Her color was good, her eyes were clear and alert, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone recovering from a serious illness rather than the frailty typically associated with death from natural causes. The months she had spent in federal protection had allowed her to recover from Margaret's poisoning attempts while gathering the evidence necessary to expose the full scope of the criminal conspiracy. Dr. Amanda Foster accompanied Rose into the courtroom, explaining to the assembled crowd how they had worked together to fake Rose's death, while secretly treating the effects of systematic digitalis poisoning administered by Margaret over a period of several months. Dr. Foster's medical expertise had been crucial for neutralizing the cardiac glycosides while maintaining the appearance of natural decline that was necessary to avoid arousing Margaret's suspicions. The staged funeral had been a masterpiece of federal investigation techniques using sophisticated mortuary procedures and closed casket arrangements to create the illusion of Rose's death while she was actually being transported to a secure location in Montana where she could recover safely while continuing to gather evidence against her sister's criminal organization. The emotional trauma of believing Rose was dead had been the most difficult part of the entire investigation for me personally. Rose's recording devices had captured hundreds of hours of conversations with Margaret Janet and their criminal associates, providing federal prosecutors with detailed evidence of their eldericide operation and inheritance fraud schemes. The audio recordings revealed the cold-blooded nature of their discussions about murdering elderly victims and stealing their assets, with particular attention to techniques for making deaths appear natural to avoid medical examiner investigations. The most damning evidence came from recordings of Margaret describing her systematic approach to identifying vulnerable elderly targets through Janet's real estate client database. They had developed sophisticated profiles of potential victims based on factors such as social isolation, family relationships, health status, and accumulated wealth, creating a systematic murder operation that had been operating undetected for over 15 years. Margaret's identity theft had been discovered through federal databases that revealed discrepancies between her claimed educational background and actual transcripts from the law schools she purported to have attended. The real Patricia Morrison's academic records showed a brilliant legal mind whose identity had been stolen by someone seeking to gain credibility and authority within Colorado's judicial system for criminal purposes. The Morrison-Blake Development Corporation's financial records revealed a complex web of fraudulent real estate transactions, money laundering operations, and illegal property seizures that had generated millions of dollars in stolen wealth over the past decade. Margaret's position as a sitting judge had provided legal cover for these criminal activities, while her false identity had protected her from background investigations that might have exposed her true relationship to many of the victims. Janet's real estate business had been the primary recruitment mechanism for identifying elderly targets, with client files containing detailed intelligence about potential victims' family relationships, health conditions, and financial resources. Her professional access to property records and estate planning documents had made it possible to identify wealthy elderly individuals who could be targeted for systematic theft through inheritance fraud schemes. The forensic analysis of Rose's garden revealed sophisticated botanical knowledge that had been used to extract cardiac glycosides from foxglove plants for use in systematic poisoning operations. Margaret had developed techniques for concentrating these toxins into nearly undetectable doses that could be administered through food beverages and herbal remedies without arousing suspicion from victims or their families. Dr. Foster's medical records showed that Rose had been receiving regular blood tests and cardiac monitoring throughout the poisoning operation, allowing her to survive Margaret's murder attempts while documenting the systematic administration of toxic substances. This medical evidence would be crucial for proving premeditated murder charges against Margaret and her criminal associates. The most emotional moment came when Rose approached me directly, tears streaming down her face, as she apologized for the trauma of letting me believe she had died while working with federal investigators to expose Margaret's crimes. Her sacrifice had been necessary to gather the evidence required to convict the criminals and protect other potential victims from similar schemes, but the personal cost had been enormous for both of us. Rose explained that she had discovered Margaret's true identity and criminal activities during the months before her supposed death, finding old family photographs and documents that revealed their sisterly relationship and Margaret's systematic theft of Patricia Morrison's identity. Rose's investigation had uncovered evidence of multiple inheritance fraud cases and suspicious deaths among elderly individuals who had been clients of Janet's real estate business. The decision to fake her own death had been made after consultation with federal investigators who needed time to build comprehensive cases against all participants in the Eldericide operation. Rose's apparent death had provided the perfect cover for gathering evidence while protecting her from further murder attempts by Margaret's criminal organization. Agent Williams revealed that federal investigators had been monitoring the conspiracy for over 2 years, initially focusing on suspicious patterns in inheritance cases handled by Margaret's court, but gradually expanding their investigation to include the broader criminal network involved in systematic elder abuse and murder. Rose's cooperation had been crucial for understanding the personal dynamics and family relationships that drove the criminal conspiracy. The arrest warrants included charges of first-degree murder conspiracy to commit murder, inheritance fraud, identity, theft, money laundering, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. The evidence collected during Rose's undercover operation would support prosecution efforts seeking life imprisonment without possibility of parole for all major participants in the Eldericide scheme. As federal agents secured the crime scene and transported the arrested criminals to federal detention facilities, Rose and I were finally able to embrace after months of separation caused by the investigation. The relief of learning she was alive was overwhelming, though the knowledge that my own mother had been planning to murder me for my inheritance created emotional trauma that would require extensive counseling to process fully. Emergency federal judge Timothy Brooks assumed jurisdiction over our case, immediately transforming the local inheritance dispute into a federal criminal proceeding with implications that extended far beyond Rose's estate. Judge Brooks had extensive experience handling complex white-collar crime cases and racketeering prosecutions, making him ideally suited to untangle the sophisticated criminal conspiracy that had been operating within Colorado's judicial system. The first order of business was securing the crime scene and preserving all evidence related to Margaret's inheritance fraud operation. Federal agents confiscated hundreds of documents from the courtroom, including the fabricated financial records that had been used to support Janet's claims about my supposed irresponsibility. Computer forensic specialists began analyzing Hoffman's electronic devices to trace the money laundering operations and identify offshore accounts used to hide stolen inheritance money. Margaret's arrest on charges of first-degree murder conspiracy, elder abuse, and financial fraud across state lines marked the beginning of what would become one of Colorado's largest federal criminal investigations. Her systematic theft of Patricia Morrison's identity 30 years earlier had enabled decades of criminal activity that resulted in the deaths of over 30 elderly victims throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The revelation that Margaret was actually Rose's sister added layers of betrayal and family dysfunction that shocked even experienced federal investigators. Agent Williams explained that family members were statistically the most likely perpetrators of elder abuse and inheritance fraud. But the scope and sophistication of Margaret's criminal operation exceeded anything typically encountered in domestic cases. Janet's confession came during her initial interrogation at the federal detention facility, where she revealed the full extent of her participation in the Eldericide scheme, while attempting to negotiate a plea agreement that would reduce her potential life sentence. Her detailed statements provided federal prosecutors with inside information about victim selection processes, murder techniques, and asset distribution methods used by Margaret's criminal organization. The most shocking aspect of Janet's confession involved the revelation that she had murdered my father when I was young, making his death appear to be a heart attack through the systematic administration of cardiac glycosides extracted from common garden plants. This murder had been Margaret's idea, designed to eliminate potential interference with their long-term plans to steal Rose's accumulated wealth through inheritance fraud. Janet explained that Margaret had identified my father as a potential obstacle to their criminal plans because of his close relationship with Rose and his natural protectiveness regarding family financial matters. His death had been carefully planned to appear natural, while simultaneously traumatizing Rose and making her more dependent on Margaret for emotional support during her grieving process. The medical examiner's files from my father's death were immediately reopened for forensic review, revealing inconsistencies that had been overlooked during the original investigation 20 years earlier. Modern toxicology techniques would be able to detect evidence of digitalis poisoning that had not been identifiable using the analytical methods available during the 1990s. Dr. Nash's plea bargain provided additional details about the systematic falsification of death certificates and medical documentation used to cover up Margaret's murder operation. His forensic accounting credentials had been crucial for creating fraudulent psychological evaluations and financial assessments that provided legal justification for transferring assets away from legitimate heirs to criminal control. The discovery that I had actually been stolen as a baby added the most disturbing dimension to the entire criminal conspiracy. Janet's confession revealed that Margaret had orchestrated my father's murder specifically to gain access to me as a future inheritance target, knowing that Rose would eventually leave her wealth to her beloved grandson, rather than her obviously dysfunctional daughter. Federal investigators determined that Margaret was actually my biological grandmother on my father's side, making Rose my great-aunt, rather than my grandmother in the traditional sense. However, Rose had legally adopted me after my father's death, creating legitimate family relationships that had been manipulated by Margaret's criminal planning for over 20 years. The emotional impact of learning that my entire life had been based on systematic deception and criminal conspiracy was overwhelming, requiring immediate psychiatric support to process the trauma of discovering that my mother had murdered my father and stolen me as a baby to facilitate long-term inheritance fraud. The realization that every family relationship I had known was contaminated by criminal conspiracy created psychological wounds that would require years of therapy to heal. Bradley Hoffman's financial records revealed the sophisticated money laundering operation that had been used to hide stolen inheritance money from over 30 victims throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. His law firm had been processing millions of dollars in fraudulent assets while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal practice, using offshore accounts and shell companies to disguise the criminal origins of their wealth. The Morrison Blake Development Corporation's collapse had been inevitable, once federal investigators began scrutinizing their financing sources and real estate acquisition methods. Their high-risk speculation deals had been funded entirely by stolen inheritance money, creating a house of cards that was bound to collapse when their supply of elderly victims was disrupted by law enforcement intervention. Dr. Amanda Foster's medical records provided detailed documentation of Rose's recovery from systematic digitalis poisoning, showing how carefully controlled antidotes had been administered to neutralize the toxic effects while maintaining the appearance of natural decline. Her courage in participating in the dangerous undercover operation had been crucial for gathering the evidence necessary to convict Margaret and her criminal associates. The Swiss bank account established by Rose contained over $5 million in assets recovered from Margaret's various inheritance fraud schemes, along with detailed financial records documenting the systematic theft from elderly victims throughout the region. This money would eventually be returned to surviving family members of victims who had been murdered for their inheritance. Federal prosecutors announced their intention to seek death penalty charges against Margaret for the systematic murder of elderly victims, while Janet would face life imprisonment without possibility of parole for her role in the Eldericide operation and the murder of my father. Dr. Nash and Bradley Hoffman would receive substantial prison sentences for their participation in the conspiracy, though their cooperation with investigators might result in reduced terms. The investigation expanded to include dozens of suspicious inheritance cases handled by Margaret's court during her 30-year career as a sitting judge with federal agents working to identify additional victims and recover stolen assets for distribution to legitimate heirs. The scope of the criminal conspiracy suggested that hundreds of families had been affected by Margaret's systematic theft and murder operation. Rose's courage in enduring months of systematic poisoning while gathering evidence against her own sister represented one of the most extraordinary examples of personal sacrifice for justice that federal investigators had ever encountered. Her willingness to risk her life to expose the criminal conspiracy had prevented countless additional murders while ensuring that Margaret and her associates would face appropriate criminal penalties. The legal proceedings would take several years to complete given the complex nature of the charges and the extensive evidence that needed to be presented in federal court. However, the overwhelming documentation of criminal conspiracy and systematic murder made convictions virtually certain for all participants in Margaret's Eldericide operation. My inheritance was not only secured but substantially increased due to the recovery of stolen assets from other victims of Margaret's criminal scheme. However, the emotional trauma of learning that my entire family history had been built on systematic deception and murder created psychological challenges that would require extensive counseling and support to overcome. 6 months after the dramatic courtroom arrests, the federal criminal cases against Margaret and her accomplices had progressed to plea negotiations and sentencing hearings that would bring final justice to the dozens of families affected by their systematic Eldericide operation. Margaret received a life imprisonment without possibility of parole for the premeditated murders of over 30 elderly victims, while Janet was sentenced to life plus 20 years for her role in the conspiracy and the murder of my father. Judge Timothy Brooks presided over the sentencing hearings with appropriate gravity, noting that the scope and sophistication of Margaret's criminal enterprise represented one of the most disturbing cases of systematic elder abuse in federal court history. His detailed remarks emphasized the violation of public trust inherent in Margaret's use of judicial authority to facilitate inheritance fraud and murder, describing her crimes as attacks on the fundamental integrity of America's legal system. Dr. Kevin Nash received a 15-year sentence for falsifying death certificates and providing fraudulent medical documentation to support the inheritance theft schemes, while Bradley Hoffman was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for money laundering and conspiracy charges. Both men were permanently disbarred from practicing their respective professions, and required to forfeit all assets obtained through participation in the criminal enterprise. The financial restitution phase of the proceedings resulted in the recovery of over $8 million in stolen assets from various offshore accounts and fraudulent real estate investments. This money was distributed among the surviving family members of Margaret's victims, providing some measure of compensation for their losses, while ensuring that the criminals derived no financial benefit from their systematic murders. My inheritance was ultimately increased to approximately $4 million due to the recovery of assets that Margaret had stolen from Rose's business accounts during the months before her supposed death. However, the most valuable legacy from Rose was not financial, but rather the demonstration of courage and sacrifice she had shown in exposing the criminal conspiracy that threatened so many other elderly Americans. The Rose Patterson Foundation for Elder Protection was established using the recovered assets, creating a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal advocacy and safety services for elderly Americans, vulnerable to exploitation by family members, legal professionals, and medical practitioners. The Foundation's mission reflected Rose's commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves from systematic abuse and financial manipulation. The Foundation's services included free legal clinics staffed by retired attorneys and judges who volunteered their time to help elderly clients navigate complex inheritance planning and family disputes. Educational programs were developed to teach seniors about common fraud schemes and manipulation techniques used by criminals targeting their accumulated wealth and property. Community outreach initiatives brought Foundation representatives to senior centers, retirement communities, and assisted living facilities throughout Colorado and neighboring states, providing information about protective legal measures and warning signs of potential elder abuse. The Foundation also maintained a 24-hour hotline for elderly individuals who suspected they were being targeted for financial exploitation or physical harm. The 3 Patterson Pages bookshops were converted into community centers offering literacy programs, computer training for seniors, and meeting spaces for support groups serving elderly Americans dealing with family conflicts and legal challenges. These centers provided safe environments where seniors could access resources and connect with others facing similar difficulties, creating networks of mutual support and protection. My personal healing process required extensive therapy with Dr. Lisa Martinez, a specialist in trauma recovery, who helped me understand the psychological impact of learning that my entire family history had been built on systematic deception and criminal conspiracy. The revelation that my mother had murdered my father and stolen me as a baby created identity issues that required careful therapeutic intervention to resolve successfully. Dr. Martinez's approach emphasized the importance of distinguishing between the criminal actions of Margaret and Janet versus the genuine love and protection that Rose had provided throughout my childhood and early adulthood. Rose's decision to adopt me legally after my father's death had created authentic family bonds that transcended the criminal conspiracy that had originally brought us together. The therapeutic process also involved learning to forgive myself for not recognizing the signs of criminal conspiracy earlier, despite the sophisticated nature of Margaret's deception and the extensive resources she had used to maintain her false identity and judicial authority. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that even trained federal investigators had required years to uncover the full scope of the criminal enterprise. During the second year after the trials, I met Emma Rodriguez, a social worker specializing in elder abuse prevention, who shared my passion for protecting vulnerable, elderly Americans from exploitation and harm. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect for the difficult work we were both doing, and genuine appreciation for the courage required to confront systematic injustice within established institutions. Emma's professional experience complemented the Foundation's mission perfectly. Bringing expertise in social services and community organizing, that enhanced our ability to identify at-risk elderly individuals and connect them with appropriate protective resources. Her bilingual abilities also expanded our outreach capabilities within Colorado's growing Hispanic community, where cultural barriers often prevented elderly individuals from accessing legal and social services. The Foundation's impact grew steadily during its first 3 years of operation, helping over 2,000 elderly Coloradans navigate family disputes, inheritance planning challenges, and suspected abuse situations. Our success stories included preventing several inheritance fraud schemes similar to Margaret's operation, protecting elderly clients from systematic financial manipulation by family members and legal professionals. Letters from grateful families became a regular part of Foundation operations with adult children, thanking us for helping their elderly parents recognize and escape from abusive situations before serious harm occurred. These testimonials provided emotional validation for the difficult work we were doing, while demonstrating the ongoing need for elder protection services throughout American communities. The Foundation also worked closely with federal and state law enforcement agencies to identify patterns of suspicious activity that might indicate systematic elder abuse or inheritance fraud operations. Our database of common techniques and warning signs became a valuable resource for investigators seeking to understand and combat these sophisticated criminal enterprises. Educational partnerships with medical schools and law schools created curricula focused on recognizing and reporting suspected elder abuse, ensuring that future healthcare providers and legal professionals would be better prepared to identify and prevent systematic exploitation of elderly clients. These programs emphasize the ethical responsibilities inherent in serving vulnerable populations. 5 years after the trials, I received notification that Margaret had died in federal prison from complications related to cancer, bringing final closure to the criminal conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives while traumatizing countless families throughout Colorado and neighboring states. Her death meant that the remaining victims and their families could finally begin healing without fear of potential retaliation or continued legal challenges. Janet remained in federal prison serving her life sentence with no possibility of parole or early release due to the severity of her crimes and her central role in the systematic murder operation. Occasional letters from her attempting to justify her actions or claim reformed character were forwarded to me through the federal correctional system, but I chose not to respond to these communications. The most meaningful closure came during a private ceremony at Rose's actual gravesite, where she had been buried 6 months after the trials concluded, following her peaceful death from natural causes at the age of 84. The ceremony included Foundation staff therapy clients and several families whose elderly relatives had been saved from potential abuse through our intervention programs. Rose's headstone bore a simple inscription reflecting her life's mission. She protected those who needed protection most. Below this was a quote from her favorite author: "The true measure of any society is how it treats its most vulnerable members." These words captured the essence of both Rose's personal character and the Foundation's ongoing commitment to elder protection. Speaking at the ceremony, I shared the profound life lesson that Rose's courage had taught me about the true meaning of family justice and personal responsibility. Family relationships are not defined by blood connections, but by love sacrifice and shared commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. True strength comes from standing up to those who abuse power and authority, even when they are family members or respected community leaders. The greatest inheritance Rose left me was not financial wealth, but the understanding that accumulated resources carry moral obligations to serve others, particularly those who face systematic exploitation or abuse. Her willingness to risk her life to expose Margaret's criminal conspiracy demonstrated that personal safety must sometimes be sacrificed to prevent greater harm to innocent people. The Foundation's work continues to grow and evolve, adapting to new forms of elder abuse and exploitation, while maintaining Rose's core mission of protecting vulnerable elderly Americans from those who would harm them for financial gain. Each family we help, each abuse scheme we prevent, each elderly person we protect represents a living memorial to Rose's courage and sacrifice. Through this experience, I learned that the most dangerous predators often hide behind facades of respectability and authority, using their positions to exploit trust and manipulate legal systems for criminal purposes. However, I also learned that truth ultimately prevails when courageous individuals are willing to sacrifice personal safety to expose systematic injustice and protect those who need protection most. The Foundation has helped me transform personal trauma into purposeful action, creating meaning from suffering, while honoring Rose's legacy through continued service to elderly Americans facing similar threats from those who should protect them, but instead seek to exploit them. This work provides daily reminders that every individual has the power to make a difference in protecting vulnerable community members from systematic abuse and exploitation. Looking back on this journey, I am grateful for Rose's extraordinary courage in enduring systematic poisoning to expose Margaret's criminal conspiracy, preventing countless additional murders, while ensuring that justice would ultimately prevail. Her sacrifice demonstrated that love sometimes requires enduring great personal cost to protect others, and that family loyalty should never extend to enabling criminal behavior or systematic abuse. The experience also taught me that healing from profound betrayal requires time, professional support, and purposeful action to prevent similar harm to others. Working with the Foundation has provided therapeutic benefits, while creating positive change that honors the memory of those who suffered from Margaret's systematic crimes against elderly Americans throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Today, as I reflect on everything that has happened, I want to ask you a question that goes to the heart of what we all owe to the elderly people in our lives. Have you ever noticed signs that an older family member or friend might be experiencing financial exploitation or abuse? And what steps did you take to investigate and protect them from potential harm? Your awareness and action could literally save someone's life, just as Rose's courage saved mine and protected countless other potential victims from systematic predators who hide behind facades of respectability and family relationships. If this story has moved you or opened your eyes to the realities of elder abuse in America, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice and family courage. Share this content with others who need to understand these important issues, and leave a comment describing your own experiences with protecting elderly loved ones from exploitation and abuse. Thank you for listening to this difficult but important story about the power of courage, the meaning of true family, and the ongoing responsibility we all share to protect the most vulnerable members of our communities from those who would harm them for personal gain. Remember that every elderly person deserves safety, dignity, and protection from systematic abuse, and that each of us has the power to make a difference in ensuring their well-being and security. May you find the strength to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, and may you never underestimate the power of love and courage to overcome even the most sophisticated forms of evil and systematic exploitation.